The average Imperial citizen would be forgiven for thinking that, Primarchs aside, the Space Marines are the greatest warriors the Emperor ever created. When compared to this group, however, the Adeptus Astartes fall a long way short. These seemingly ageless warriors have been present at the Emperor's side potentially since his appearance, armed and armoured with the finest equipment perhaps ever seen in human history. They are, and always have been, his personal guard, the projection of his indomitable will, with authority over all both in the Imperium and on the battlefield. Though they retreated to Terra at the close of the Horus Heresy, they have never abandoned their primary mission, and in recent times they have begun to depart the cradle of humanity once more as part of the Indomitus Crusade. Though they were once known as the 10,000, Cataclysm in the Horus Heresy has brought their numbers down to such a degree that they are commonly known as the 1,000 Companions, among other things. They are the Guardians and the Watchers of the Throne. They are the Adeptus Custodes, and this is what information we've been able to learn of them. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to 40k Stories. No one knows when the Custodian Guard, originally known as the Legio Custodes, was founded, but they seem to have been the very first of the Emperor's creations even before the Thunder Warriors that preceded the Legiones Astartes. By the way, I'm going to retcon all my previous pronunciations of Legiones to Legiones, one because Latin and two because awesome. They first appeared in the early Unification Wars, with 4 of them alongside the Emperor when he came to the Techno-Barbarians of Nassau, believed to be in ancient Germany. This was one of the first groups to submit to the future Lord of Mankind, indicating that the Custodes were perhaps created before the Unification Wars had even truly begun. Their presence in the reconquest of Terra was seemingly universal, always at the Emperor's side or occasionally without him. When the Thunder Warriors were first unleashed on Terra, bringing those who would not accept unification to heel in bloody war, the Custodians were there. When the time came for the Thunder Warriors to be culled as their purpose was served, it was the Custodes who led the operation in the now legendary battle at Mount Ararat, supposedly with the first of the Space Marines alongside them. Though if the future conflict between the Thunder Warriors and the 12th Legion is anything to go on, I suspect the Custodians did much of the heavy lifting in that battle. As the Great Crusade began and the Legiones Astartes began to reconquer the galaxy, however, the Custodes did not go with them as a massive army of conquest. Instead, they remained with the Emperor, occasionally dispatched in small detachments without him as agents, bodyguards, or destroyers. It wasn't a question of numbers, really. Despite only having seemingly exactly 10,000 members at any given time, the Custodians were more than a match for any opponents on the battlefield, both Imperial and otherwise, and there are countless records lost to time, showing that they could emerge victorious from seemingly impossible odds. Rather, the Legio Custodes was not designed as a brotherhood of warriors, but as a collection of individual bodyguards with a mind well equipped for politics as much as war. They were expected to hold conversation with the Emperor as much as defend him, a task to which they were zealously and almost fanatically committed, and unlike the team-based training of the Astartes, they all trained and fought alone, though they could and did form units when required in combat. They were also trained for diplomatic missions and assassinations, and there was, and perhaps still is, a department known as the Epheroi that may well have held jurisdiction over the Officio Assassinorum to some extent. Whether they were the predecessors to the Assassinorum we're not sure, and since Malcador the Sigillite was the master of assassins originally, it's difficult to draw any conclusions. In all honesty, isolating the duty of the Legio Custodes beyond protecting the Emperor is a little difficult, given the fact that they answered to none save the Lord of Mankind and were outside of all Imperial jurisdiction, so the details of their role and mindset are pretty much observational in nature. Even more mysterious is the true origins of the Custodes. At a glance, one would compare them to Space Marines, as they're both somewhat superhuman, having been enhanced by genetic manipulation and mental conditioning. There the similarities begin to end, however. The mental changes applied to the Custodians make them better suited as defenders rather than conquerors, and their genetic alterations are not only believed to have been made when the recipient is younger, they're invisible and wrought on a deeper level, to the point that some believe the creation of the Custodes borders on biomancy as opposed to science. Further reinforcing this is the fact that the Custodes are ageless. They're not immortal, though the fact their numbers were so consistently maintained that it may have appeared that way to the untrained eye. But unlike Space Marines, they cannot be claimed by the passing of time, another useful trait for the eternal bodyguard of the Emperor. Interestingly, it's thought that the Astartes are actually more flexible and adaptable than their Custodian cousins, which makes sense given that they were the ones designed to face up to and conquer the myriad threats facing the galaxy. Whatever the exact truth of their origins or nature, one cannot deny that the Custodes were, first and foremost, guardians of the Emperor loyal only to him, the symbol of his authority and his might. As with their nature, it's sometimes difficult to discern the organisation and structure of the Custodes. Bear in mind, a lot of this information is taken from the Great Crusade, when the Custodians were much more numerous and powerful, so any numbers will likely no longer be accurate, and things may well have changed over the millennia. As we mentioned earlier, they were a collection of individuals. Squads were not formed permanently, and each Custodian was a peer to the others as much as anything else. That said, there were still believed to be divisions within the Legio Custodes that performed different tasks. The main fighting force is known as the Haikanatoi, usually wielding their signature guardian spears and clad in ornate power armour far beyond the Astartes patterns. It was, I believe, an alloy of auramite as opposed to ceramite, the same material as the Emperor's own armour. When this was not enough, there was the Tharanatoi, all equipped with modified Terminator armour and deployed as shock troops or counterattacks to an intense pushes by the enemy. For those times when speed or manoeuvrability was needed, the Cataphractoi would pilot their various flyers, jet bikes and grav tanks that were beyond anything the Mechanicum or Imperium has constructed, or probably will ever construct. Seriously, the amount of grav tanks is just ridiculous. On the rare occasion that a Custodian would fall in battle, remember, ageless but not immortal, they could sometimes be interred into a dreadnought and become one of the Moritoi, though numbers for these lot are never believed to have passed 100 in this hallowed company. Finally, there was the Epheroi, effectively the Black Ops division of the Custodes. Counterintelligence, assassination and infiltration all fell under their remit, and as mentioned previously, they may well have at least had a hand in the direction of the Officio Assassinorum. There were some elements sitting in a command structure, but it was much less rigid and with far few ranks, at least as far as we can tell. It appears as though battlefield squad leaders were known as shield captains, whilst an equivalent but variant rank would seem to be the Prefectorate. If I were to guess, the Prefectorates would be similar to a veteran company for the Astartes, whilst the shield captains were likely veteran sergeants attached to regular squads. But it may be completely different, as it's believed the Prefectorates were the favoured of the Emperor in some way. Above them would be the equivalents of the captains of the Astartes, the Custodes Tribunes. Believed to have been 10 in number, they were the Custodians who helped to advise the Emperor, as well as overseeing the security of the Imperial Palace and forming the Custodes War Council. Above the Tribunes was only one Custodian, the leader of the order whose authority went unchallenged by his peers, the Captain General. This individual was peerless in combat, as far as we could tell anyway. Some said he was akin to a Primarch in the days when both he and they walked the battlefields of the galaxy, but this was probably almost certainly an exaggeration, as the Primarchs were a cut above just about everything else. Nonetheless, the Captain General likely had a measure of authority over all of them in a way, as the Custodes were above all imperial law and answerable only to the Lord of Mankind. This was proved in a way in recent times, as it was only with Custodian approval, not even the Captain General, even a lower rank Custodian, that the resurrected Robert Guilliman was permitted access to the Golden Throne, whilst all else were forbidden entry. The Captain General held a seat on the Emperor's War Council in the Crusade, and sometimes holds one amongst the modern civilian equivalent, the High Lords of Terror. He remains in charge of the security of the Imperial Palace, and is presumably the last line of defence for the now mortally wounded Emperor. The signature weapon, and symbol of office in a way of the Custodians, used by the Haikanatoi and most of their leaders, is the Guardian Spear that is almost unique to them. Some captains of the Death Watch also wield them now in recent times. Though there were several variations, these halberd-style power weapons were all incredibly effective in melee, but also contained powerful ranged weapons that made the Custodes even more dangerous than their already advanced genetics would have made you imagine they were. Though they would be able to swing almost any battle they fought in through their skill at arms, there are very few known engagements or operations for the Legio Custodes in the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy. The name change, by the way, is not dated, but was probably post-Heresy, since that's when it happened for the Astartes. None of the Crusade-era fights save one that we know of were without the Emperor present, and that one only saw a detachment of 5 deployed to aid the Wordbearers on 4716, their first engagement following Lorgar's humiliation by the Emperor on Monarchia. Makes me wonder if they were there to monitor the 17th Legion as much as anything else. Ironically perhaps, the Emperor had a brush with death in 2 of the engagements alongside his most trusted guards, and though the Custodes did much to defend him in the Proximan betrayal, it took the intervention of Horus Lupercal to save his Gene Father in the Battle of Goro. After Magnus the Red damaged the Imperial Webway project and confined the Emperor to the Golden Throne, the Custodes were massively committed in the battle known as the War in the Webway, fighting against demons and traitors alongside an Imperial coalition to prevent the Imperial Palace and Terra itself from being overrun by chaos. Despite their abilities, the war was incredibly costly for the 10,000, claiming around 90% of their numbers over the 5 years of conflict. it appears they've never even rebuilt their strength, which in combination with the belief that the Emperor personally oversaw their creation implies that they actually can't do it. More evidence perhaps that their creation was borderline biomancy, since it can't be replicated technologically. More than likely, the Imperials would still have lost the war, especially after the demon Dratnien possessed the leader of the Mechanican contingent and drove them from the Eldar city of Kalastar all the way back to the Webway Gate. But the actions of the Sisters of Silence allowed the Emperor to personally intervene, giving time for an evacuation before sealing the gate from the Golden Throne once more. Away from the Webway, perhaps the better-known public action in the Horus Heresy of the Custodes was as part of the Censure fleet sent to Prospero alongside Leman Russ. There they demonstrated just how superior they were to the Legiones Astartes in combat. They were dying, yes, but they were taking potentially dozens down for each of them, especially in theatres where the Thousand Suns were unable to unleash their psychic powers. 982 custodians were committed, though how many came back is unclear, and it appears as though this contingent was at least partially never committed to the war in the Webway, since its commander, the Captain General of the time, was not present in the Webway as far as we know, which, given he's the commander of the Custodes, and thus best suited to lead them without the Emperor who was on the Golden Throne, makes not too much sense unless the Prosperine contingent were not involved, or at least not fully committed. Other than Prospero, and technically the Webway I suppose, the Custodes did not leave Terra and assumedly helped with the fortification of the Imperial Palace in some way, though whether any of them took any role in aiding Dawn and Malcador beside the Captain General, we do not know. They of course fought in the Battle of Terra, initially leading a successful counterattack in the palace's courtyards, but eventually being pushed back to the Eternity Gate, the final door before the Golden Throne itself. There they will have made their stand along with the Blood Angels and Imperial Fists and potentially some of the White Scars, holding out until Horus's defeat by the Emperor. A force of custodians did go with him to the Vengeful Spirit, and one of them potentially sacrificed himself to allow the Emperor to see how far Horus had truly fallen. Following the Emperor's interment on the Golden Throne, the Custodes seemingly went into some sort of mourning. It's said they changed from their traditional golden armour to black, though no one can verify this, and they never left the Imperial Palace for 10,000 years. Guess being ageless has its perks. Thus, they've been all but absent in the modern era, only becoming involved in events that caused the Imperial Palace itself to be attacked. The best known incident was during the Age of Apostasy, when it's known that the Custodes escorted Alicia Dominica, leader of the Brides of the Emperor, to the Golden Throne itself, somehow convincing her and her order to turn on Goj Van Dyer and then become the Adeptus Sororitas. The first time the Custodes were seen outside the Imperial Palace was in M41 for the Battle of Luna, accompanying the Sisters of Silence to drive back Magnus the Red and the Thousand Suns before they could either slay the reborn Guilliman or access Terra through the Webway. They now form part of the new Indomitus Crusade, but around 300 custodians known as the Companions have remained to continue their vigil over the Emperor. It's unclear if these companions are the same individuals as the Heteran Guard, who formed the Emperor's personal guard in the past and were the elite of the Hycanatoi that we mentioned earlier, but I find it likely, given that they're probably the same people, that there is at least a connection between the two groups. Though they are a mysterious order, we do know of a few members of both the Legio and Adeptus Custodes. The most famous is undoubtedly their Captain General in the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy, known as the First of the 10,000, Constantin Valdor. His epithet suggests he may have been the first custodian ever created, or at least the first successful one during their design process. I hesitate to call him the template because each custodian was more individual than the Astartes, but it's perhaps not a terrible analogy. If you thought a custodian was an incredible warrior, then Valdor was akin to a demigod of war. He was sometimes thought of by people as a Primarch in all but name, but even he would almost certainly lose to any of the Emperor's sons eventually, I suspect. Valdor was the head of the custodian contingent dispatched to Prospero with the Space Wolves. Interestingly, he went along with Horus's modified orders to wipe out Magnus and co, rather than arrest the Crimson King. I don't know why, given he answered to the Emperor personally rather than Horus. I can only assume that he was with Russ when the order was sent, rather than being told personally by the Emperor. Whatever the case, he went along with the order change, and Prospero burned. He led the second wave of the invasion, realising that the Silent Sisterhood needed to be clustered together to provide any level of psychic protection, allowing his small contingent to rendezvous with Russ and keep the offensive going. Once he returned to Terra, Valdor worked alongside Malcador the Sigillite, or more accurately the Master of Assassins, who was Malcador in disguise, coordinating the first ever execution force in an attempt to take out Horus Lupercal. It failed, obviously, but some valuable information was uncovered. Valdor was part of the forces in the Battle of Terra, though whether he boarded the Vengeful Spirit is unknown, but it is also thought that he either retired, which seems odd for a custodian, or died in a battle unknown, or maybe committed ritual suicide. I honestly couldn't tell you. The reason we know this is because when the Eldari launched a raid on the Imperial Palace in the War of the Beast, the last Harlequin was arrested by a Captain General, but it was not Constantine Valdor. Instead, the new Captain General was an individual named Beiruth, who was poised to kill the Shadowseer, who insisted she'd come in peace with orders from Eldrad Ulthran to give a message to the Emperor. He was stopped from killing her by the inquisitorial representative of the High Lords of Terror, who apparently forced the Custodian to release the Eldar into their custody, which makes no sense to me since, Custodes, but whatever. Beiruth was also convinced following the beheading, a coup of the High Lords of Terror by Grandmaster of Assassins Draken Vangerich, to become a member of the reformed Senatorum Imperialis. But when Vangerich was in turn overthrown and the High Lords were once again reorganised, it's unknown if he retained his seat. The Captain General still doesn't hold a permanent seat today, so I suspect he lost it, at least for a while. The current Captain General is unknown. It may still be Beiruth, since the Custodes are of course ageless, but we have no evidence either way. There are also a pair of well-known tribunes, one from the 31st millennium and one from the modern age. Ra Endymion was recruited into the Custodes during the Unification Wars at the age of 4, which seems young, but the Custodes were created in late infancy as opposed to adolescence, so it does make sense. He earned himself 831 names through his career. Custodians earn names in recognition of mighty deeds, so he was obviously an active and powerful fighter. Being a tribune, this is no surprise. He was the sole tribune to survive until the end of the war within the Webway, meaning he was in overall command of the Custodes and likely all Imperial forces present. When the Emperor arrived and fought Draknian, he impaled Ra with the demon's sword, well, the demon that was masquerading as a sword as far as I'm aware, and bound it to him, before telling the tribune to run. His eventual fate is almost certain death, as Draknian would of course become free of Endymion at some point, since it was claimed by Warmaster Abaddon in the First Black Crusade. By contrast, we know nothing of the history of Malvadar Colquhoun, a tribune in the Indomitus Crusade who led the Custodian contingent in it. He makes an interesting study, as apparently his strategic sense was rather dulled by the passage of time. What this says as to the training regimen of the Custodes in their vigil over the Emperor, I'm not quite sure. He also held a distaste for unmodified humans, i.e. those who weren't a Custodes or an Astartes, etc., so much so that it was disconcerting to the reborn Guilliman. Whether this is merely his opinion or a more general aloofness amongst the Custodes we can't say, but I somehow suspect the former, as many Space Marines are also callous regarding human forces. Maybe it's a part of their design, in which case it will be the latter, actually. Who knows? But as far as we do know, Colquhoun is still the leader of the Custodes in the Indomitus Crusade, even if he's not their overall commander, as of course, he's not Captain General. So end the tales of the Adeptus Custodes. These incredible warriors stand a cut above practically every infantry in the Imperium, or perhaps the galaxy at large, fitting guardians for one such as the Emperor of Mankind. Though they may have in some eyes failed at their task, they continue their vigil over the Lord of Humanity and have finally begun to prosecute his wars once more alongside his reborn son. The Custodians are genetic miracles with some of the finest armour, arms and equipment the Imperium has ever produced. Woe betide any unfortunate enough to have to fight them. Now, since we're on Terra, and we've covered the Guardians of the Imperial Palace, I think it's only fair that we take a look at the reason they're still there rather than out wrecking the enemies of humanity. Yes, ladies and gentlemen and Xenos of all ages, next time we'll be taking a look at the one, the only, the Emperor of Mankind, covering what we know of his history, his actions, and his current role in guiding humanity through the age of the Imperium. My colleague also tells me that his channel, whatever one of those is coming up on some major milestone, so that this should be an apt way to celebrate it as a sort of grand finale or a bonus part to the Legions mini-series we recently finished. Thank you all for watching. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.